Okay, Cuban Missile Crisis, Monday, October 22nd, 1962. Early that morning, on Monday morning, President Kennedy telephoned 3 former presidents to brief them on the situation. So the first people really to know, civilians, about this crisis prior to the speech on Monday night will be 3 former presidents. Kennedy calls them and explains the situation in Cuba. Anybody want to guess who those presidents were?
Eisenhower.
President Eisenhower, Truman, and former President Herbert Hoover, who was still alive way back. So on Monday morning, President Kennedy telephoned former presidents Herbert Hoover, Harry Truman, and Dwight Eisenhower and briefed them on the situation in Cuba. He then wrote a correspondence to Soviet Premier Khrushchev. Okay? He wrote a correspondence to Soviet Premier Khrushchev. And you don't have to write down exactly what this said, but this is what he said to Khrushchev in a correspondence. He said, quote, "I have not assumed that you or any other sane man would in this nuclear age deliberately plunge the world into a war which it is crystal clear no country could win, and which could only result in catastrophic consequences to the whole world." So he's letting Khrushchev know Monday morning that we know about the missiles. Now I'll read that one more time. He said, "I have not assumed that you or any other sane man would in this nuclear age deliberately plunge the world into war which it is crystal clear no country could win, and which could only result in catastrophic consequences to the whole world." So he's letting Khrushchev, basically, are you nuts? Are you really doing this? Well, it was at that time that officially Pierre Salinger announced, as the paper said, that President Kennedy will address the nation tonight on radio and television on a subject of the highest national urgency. And that's what resulted in the evening edition of the newspaper that night. It came out prior to his speech, okay? And that resulted from Pierre Salinger's quote. Now, Kennedy's got to make some preparations prior to his speech, so I'm going to give you 4 examples of preparations that President Kennedy made prior to giving his speech that evening. Now, he has not made his decision, but this might give you an idea which way he's going. Number 1, he ordered the United States Navy to begin preparations for a blockade or quarantine of Cuba. So one thing he did prior to his speech is he ordered the Navy to begin preparations for the naval blockade of Cuba. Be prepared. That might be my decision. Number 2, he even kind of drew a line in the sand, so to speak, on how far he would let those 25 Soviet ships advance towards Cuba before the United States would take action. He actually drew a line in the sand, actually the sea, saying if you cross this line, we will take action. So he actually drew a line in the sand on how far he would let these 25 Soviet ships advance towards Cuba before action would be taken. Third thing he did is he informed military personnel that if any of those merchant ships crossed his line and entered American waters, they would be attacked. He made it clear to the military that if any of these 25 merchant ships cross that line and they enter into American waters, they will be attacked. And the fourth one might have been the scariest one. He stated that if they attacked those ships, because they crossed that line, he made it clear that war would be declared by the United States upon the Soviet Union. And we were that serious about this. So the fourth preparation he made is he made it clear to the military that if that quarantine line was ignored and we had to fire upon their ships, that the United States would declare war upon the Soviet Union. Pretty serious business.
So, is he still doing the part where they stop and check the ships?
Well, we're going to get to that. That's the plan still, but we got to get to that's a great question, but we got to get to that. Okay.
So then, has he talked to Congress about this to get?
That's coming next.
Consensus on the war?
Very good. So at 5 o'clock that night, that would be Eastern Standard Time. Mason hit it right on the head. President Kennedy briefed Congress on his decision that he was going to enact a naval quarantine or blockade. So before he talks to the American people, he meets with leaders of Congress and explains the situation in Cuba and tells what his decision will be. And as Mason very astutely figured out, you might want some support from Congress on this deal. Well, Kennedy briefed Congress at 5 o'clock, and he was just pissed and frustrated because he found out during that meeting with the leaders of Congress that he had very little support for his plan. Very good, Mason. So at 5 o'clock p.m. that night, Kennedy meets with leaders of Congress on his decision to enact a quarantine of Cuba. The president became very angry, very frustrated when he realized that he had very little support among those leaders for his plan of action. Well, he's getting ready to go on camera, and he's mad. And I've been in this business of education a lot of years, and when I was younger, I gave a lot of great speeches I live to regret. When you make decisions on when you're mad or angry or emotionally, they don't come out very well. And so Kenneth O'Donnell could sense that the president was frustrated, and he was also could sense that he was angry. He did not want him to go on camera unsettled. And so Kenneth O'Donnell asked the president, he said, I need a word before you go to give your national address. I need a word. So O'Donnell just grabs him and says, hey, I need a word. And President Kennedy got kind of pissed at him, and he says, you know, I don't have time for you to give me a word. And he said, you're the President of the United States. They will wait for you. And he really was harsh on the president, probably over the line a little bit, but he had that ability because he wanted to get him settled down before he got on national television. So when President Kennedy tried to explain to O'Donnell that he didn't have time to give him a word, he insisted, stating, you're the President of the United States. They can wait for you, right? Well, O'Donnell did a great job. He proceeded to settle the president down. And it wasn't like 2 minutes before he walked in. He wanted some time, an hour maybe, to get him settled down. So he settled him down before his speech. Well, while this was happening at 6 o'clock, Secretary of State Dean Rusk formally notified Russian Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin the contents of the president's speech. Now, Anatoly Dobrynin was the Russian ambassador to the United States. Gromyko was a diplomat. Difference. This guy is like the Adlai Stevenson to the United Nations. Anatoly Dobrynin is the Russian ambassador to the United States. Here's a picture of him right here. Anatoly Dobrynin. And what Kennedy does at 6 o'clock out of courtesy is he lets that Russian ambassador know that they are going to enforce a naval blockade on Cuba. Lets them know that. Well, 7 o'clock, Kennedy leaves to the Oval Office to give his speech. O'Donnell's got him settled down, and he's going to give his speech as planned at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Monday, October 24th, 1962. And Kennedy addresses the nation concerning the crisis in Cuba, and he informs the American people these 5 things. This is what he tells them. This is what Kennedy tells the American people in his speech beginning at 7 o'clock on October 22nd, 1962. What does he tell the American people? Number 1, he tells them about the missile construction sites in Cuba. Tells them about the missile construction sites in Cuba. Number 2, he tells them that there are already missiles in Cuba. So number 1, he tells them about the missile construction sites in Cuba. And then number 2, he tells them that there are already missiles on the ground in Cuba. He also tells the American people, number 3, that the Soviet Union were denying that there are any missiles or missile construction pads in Cuba. That the Soviet Union had been denying the fact that they had placed missiles and were constructing launching pads in Cuba. Told the American people they basically lied to us. They were denying it. Told the American people that the Soviet Union was denying any missiles or construction sites were in Cuba. Fourth thing he informed the American public was his decision to enact the naval blockade of Cuba. He told the citizens of the United States about his decision to enact the naval blockade of Cuba. So have they done it yet? Just keep that in mind. Has he officially enacted this? No. Yeah.
Did he call it a blockade? Or did he call it a quarantine?
He called it quarantine. And the fifth thing he told them concerned the seriousness of his actions if Cuba made the decision, basically as McCone said, to use them or lose them. Okay? In other words, he explained the seriousness of his actions if Cuba made the decision to launch any missiles against the United States. This is what will happen, basically. He ends his speech by saying, "It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union." I'll read that again. So the fifth thing he tells the American people is what he will do if Cuba makes the decision to launch any of those missiles. He said, quote, "It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any country, or any nation, excuse me, in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union." What he's saying, kids, is if they launch a missile against the United States or anybody in the West, we're launching Jupiter missiles from Turkey onto the Soviet Union. That's what he's saying. Yeah?
What was the fourth one again?
The fourth one is, he basically stated in the fourth one that he was going to put a naval quarantine on Cuba. That ends Monday, October 22nd, 1963, and moves us to Tuesday, October 23rd, 1963. Now this will answer Hannah's question that she talked about earlier on what we're going to do exactly, because where's the concern now? Now that he's given his speech, what are we paying attention to? Those 25 Soviet merchant ships. Okay, they're heading to Cuba. So, on the morning of October 23rd, 1962, XCOM met again. And of course, as Hannah asked, the President's greatest concern was what action will the Navy take if the Soviet ships refuse our ultimatum? Don't stop the quarantine line. He's made a general statement that we're going to attack them. Yeah.
So those merchant ships, they already know that.
They do now. Yep, that's a good point. They do now. And our concern is, are they going to, they think we're bluffing? Kennedy said if they cross this line, they're going to be attacked, generally. Now, he wants to know the morning of the 23rd, how are you going to do that? What's the procedure? Okay? What are the rules of engagement? That's a key term. So, basically what happened is Bobby Kennedy asked Admiral George Anderson. Okay, this is George Anderson right here. We talked about him. Okay? Admiral Anderson of the Navy. Bobby Kennedy says, "Admiral Anderson, could you please explain to the XCOM committee what are the rules of engagement concerning these ships moving to Cuba?" And it's a 4-step rule of engagement. I'll have you write them down step by step. Okay? So step 1. As those merchant ships were heading towards the quarantine line established by Kennedy, the Navy would attempt to make radio contact with the approaching Soviet ships using sailors fluent in Russian. So they're going to try to contact those ships by radio before they get to the quarantine line. So that was step 1. The Navy would attempt to make radio contact with approaching Soviet ships using sailors fluent in Russian. Anybody see the movie U-571 about the German submarine? You ever seen that show? They used soldiers fluent in German. Okay. Step 2. Once they made radio contact with those approaching Soviet ships, the Soviet ships would be ordered to reduce speed and stand by for inspection. Okay? So the Soviet ships, step 2, would be ordered to reduce speed and stand by for inspection. So first step is they're going to make radio contact. Second step is they're going to order them to reduce speed and stand by for inspection. Step 3 is a Navy inspection team would board the ship and search the Soviet vessel. That was step 3. Once they made contact and got them to reduce speed and stand by for inspection, a Navy inspection team would board that Russian merchant ship and search the vessel. And step 4, if the vessel contained offensive weapons, any weapons, not just missiles, but any offensive weapons, the ship would be ordered by the United States Navy to turn back out of the quarantine and go where? Back to Russia. So are they going to seize the contraband? No, they're trying to avoid war here. They're just going to search the ship. If it does have offensive weapons, they're going to be ordered to turn around and go back home.
What if they don't stop?
There you go. So Bobby then asked Admiral Anderson, well, what's our course of action going to be if the Soviet ships refuse to stop and be searched? Very good question. Because who wants to know all this information? The President and XCOM. So as soon as he gives the rules of engagement, which you have the 4 steps of rules of engagement, Bobby Kennedy says to Admiral Anderson, okay, Admiral, what happens if they refuse to stop and be searched? Pretty good question. Well, Admiral, now this is important you get this down. Admiral Anderson stated that if the Russian ships refused to be searched, they would be towed into the nearest port. In other words, if they stopped and refused to be searched, the Navy would take that merchant ship and tow it into the nearest port. So what would be your next question, Mason?
If it doesn't stop.
If it doesn't stop. Bobby continued his line of questioning and asked Admiral Anderson, well, what would be the course of action if the Soviet ships simply run the blockade? They don't slow down, okay? We radio contact them, we ask them to slow down to be searched, they just run the blockade. What are we going to do then? Well, he gave a 2-step process if that happened. So when Bobby continued his line of questioning and asked what would be the course of action if the Soviet ship simply ran the blockade, Admiral Anderson responded by stating the following 2 steps. Step 1, if that happened, is the Navy would shoot a warning shot across the bow of the ship, of the Soviet ship. Okay, the Navy would shoot a warning shot. If they ran the blockade, or the quarantine line, they would simply shoot a warning shot across the bow of the Soviet ship. Well, your next question might be, well, gee whiz, what do we do if they ignore the warning shot, right? That was step 2. If the ship ignored the warning shot, the Navy would fire at the ship's rudder, disable the ship, and carry on with their inspection. So if they ran the blockade, they would fire a warning shot over the bow of the Soviet ship. If they ignored that warning shot and still kept going, the United States Navy would then shoot out the ship's rudder, the thing that makes it go, disable the ship, and carry on with the inspection. This is where Kennedy got nervous. And he stepped into the conversation and he made it very clear there will be no firing on any Soviet ships within that quarantine zone without my explicit permission. He wasn't going to let the military put him in a war. So he made it really clear in that meeting to Admiral Anderson, there will be no firing on any Soviet ships without my explicit permission. Are you clear on that, Admiral? Yes, sir. So we have the rules of engagement, the 4 steps rules of engagement, and then the process after that. If they refuse to be searched, they'll be towed to the nearest port. If they simply run the blockade, we would shoot a warning shot across the bow of the ship. If they continued, we would shoot out their rudder, disable the ship, and carry on with the inspection. At that point, President Kennedy said, there'll be no firing on any Soviet ships without my explicit permission. Okay, they get done with that tense discussion, and another topic of discussion comes up. And it had to do with further spy flights over Cuba. Okay? Because they want to keep track of what's going on, because they want to make sure these missiles do not become operational. How are they going to know whether they're getting closer to that? They got to do these flights. The problem is, from way up here, you can't really tell real well whether those launching pads are going to become operational. So these U-2 flights are going to be low-level, on-the-deck flights over the island. I mean on the deck, right over the top. Okay? So we're not going to have these people way up here taking these pictures like you saw at the start of the movie. These are going to be low levels, on the deck, right over Cuba, so they can get good pictures. The low-level flights are needed to get the best photographs of the missiles and missile launching pads. Now, are these going to be risky? Absolutely. You think the airplanes are going to get shot upon? Sure they are. You know, they're not going to let these spy planes come over the deck and not, not retaliate. Now, you got to think about this. During this meeting, when they talked about these low-level flights on the deck, they talked about the risk, they talked about the chances of being shot at, and the military made it very clear that if their pilots were shot upon during these low-level flights, the military would have to do what? Retaliate. So the military made it very clear on action that they would be taking if their pilots were shot down during these low-level flights. And President Kennedy listened to everything. And then he had to make a decision. Is he going to allow these low-level flights or not? What's he decide? What? He's got to. Because they got to have the information. But again, are we taking another step towards possible war? Because if you know